An institution is not a consumer. You are a consumer. They categorize you as retail, and they choose your strategies because you consume your strategies. They get to create opportunities for you on the market. When you understand how you move, then you will stop allowing your enemy to move you. All right, so this is going to be a series on trading equivalent to war. So for me, I've been a trader for the past 9 years, and a lot of my strategies are designed off market algorithms, right? There's a lot of other people out there that trade in a lot of different ways, but for me specifically, in my previous video, if you haven't watched it, you should check it out. But we talk about philosophy, so I'm going to extend from that to be more applicable to trading and using a war philosophy, right? So for me, I have a military background as well. Strategy is everything to do with trading. So when it comes down to strategy, war is the epitome of strategy, right? You have countries going against countries, men versus men, generals versus generals, right? You see a lot of games that emulate this same thing, and there's lots of strategies in the world that we know today. So for me, I'm going to unveil my psychology towards war and the equivalence to how I use it on the market. But before I can do that, I need to lay out the philosophy that I use for war. The simplest explanation of war strategy is turning a negative situation into a positive one. That is the simplest way that I could describe it, and the ways that I've heard from many different books. So a negative situation turning into a positive, if you're currently a trader, you would already see this type of correlation for yourself. So I have written down here, we are self-absorbed, not able to think from another mind. Even when we do it, could still be in your own way, so you don't truly gain a different perspective. To me, I need to be able to step into the mind of my enemy, and oftentimes in life, we're not actually at war, so it's very hard to determine who is your enemy and where. So it's hard to embody the idea that you need to step in the mind of your enemy because you don't really know who that enemy is. So in this philosophy, I want to lay out who these enemies are, so that way it'd be easier to step into their mind and see what strategies they're using against us, creating psychology that they put us in loops, manipulate us in those manners. So we'll get into it. So what is war? By definition, I love definitions, a state of period of armed hostility or active military operations. A state or period of armed hostility or active military operations. The next thing I have here is psychological operations. So in the military, I've learned about psychological operations, and it's a very interesting perspective. Psychological operations are to convey selected information to audiences that will influence their motives and objective reasoning and ultimately the behavior. Some really key words in there. An example of psychological warfare is the use of leaflets or paper in order to convey manipulative information. So we're talking propaganda, right? Back in the day, if you were, let's say, America, you would make news articles about the enemy's generals, and then while you're on the battlefield, you would drop this kind of propaganda. The enemy would pick it up, they would read it, and then they would almost get data about their general, and it'll have instructions on how to surrender. So it helped a lot of the countries figure out how to surrender man by man, rather than it being an entire military-wide decision. So the definition, right, of psychological operations, there's two words in there: objective reasoning. Definition of objective reasoning: making judgments based on factual evidence, logical analysis, and unbiased observations rather than personal opinions or emotions. This is the one that is insane, okay? So psychological operations, right? It says to convey selected information to audiences that will influence their motives and objective reasoning. So think about this, right? As a person, as you as a person, where do you get your information from, right? You might get it from your phone, different companies, different articles, right? There's a lot of different sources to receive information from, but you don't really truly know the credibility other than the word of mouth. So, objective reasoning, the definition of it, making judgments based on factual evidence. Where are you getting this factual evidence? Oftentimes when you're in the military, you only get to talk to your leader, right? So if you have a sergeant, that guy is leader of your team, and then he has a boss, and then his boss has a boss, and the boss has a boss, right? So that information gets trickled down, and the next guy knows just as much as the next guy, but the guy at top knows the true intention, right? I say this to say that if you are making objective reasoning off of factual evidence, it's to your contrary belief that it is factual. So a psychological operation can feed you what you deem factual. That puts you in a state of making decisions. And that is the same influence that they are trying to do. They are trying to influence you into a certain trade, into a certain position, a certain reaction, so they can see if this is the way you react, and they can develop strategies amongst your psychology. It goes deep. So there's two things that I would like to describe as well: retail and consumer, right? These are two big words for me. When we talk about competitors in the market, we want to know who our enemies are and how to get in their minds. We also have to know that we are also our own enemy, because the strategies that you're using play against you just as much as the other guy, because the other guy knows your strategies as well as you do, because you get your strategies from YouTube and you get it from other people that may not be of an institution and they may not be of a hedge fund, right? So everyone's using different strategies, but our strategies is the most publicized because YouTube is free for everyone. But you don't get to tap into what the hedge funds are using, and you don't get to sit behind the tables of a lot of different market makers. But they get to go on YouTube and look it up all they want. They can have the money to pay for a whole research team to develop strategies around retail trading. And you only know retail trading. So, retail, the sale of goods to public in relatively small quantities for use or consumption rather than for resale. Small quantities, right? Relatively small quantities to the public for consumption rather than resale. For consumption. So that means you as a retail person, they also call you a consumer because you're not reselling things. That's not the purpose of them selling retail things. It's for you to consume. It stops at you. Consumer, a person who purchases goods and services for personal use. You are a consumer. They categorize you as retail, and they choose your strategies because you consume your strategies by looking at the market, seeing a retail pattern, taking that particular trade, and they know exactly how you're going to take it because it's perfectly designed on a lot of different YouTube videos, images on Google. You can find those types of charts, and they know exactly how to maneuver around those things. So they know you're going to consume it because it stops at you. An institution is not a consumer. Let's think of them as a manufacturer. They're the ones that create things, and then they give it to you to use. So you have to pay for these things. They get to create it out of thin air. Same thing in the market. They get to create opportunities for you on the market every time they want to manipulate your situation. You don't create opportunities for them. So that psychology and philosophy involved in this, right? If we can subscribe to the idea that these are our enemies, we have institutions, right? Market makers, retail traders, which is us. These guys, right, these three, you also have the algorithm, which isn't necessarily a person, but it's a means of rule. So in war, at least in today's sense of war, we've developed rules of war, right? Like the Geneva Convention, for example. There's certain rules, and if a country doesn't abide by them, there's repercussions. Same thing with the markets. The markets have an algorithm. The algorithm is what allows the market to stay balanced. So, for example, if I was a market maker or an institution, I can't manipulate the market too drastically because then it breaks the rules of the market. And the repercussions are things like the SEC, right? The SEC will come in and they'll see that your manipulation took place, and they can penalize you, take you to court. Maybe this is something that you shouldn't do to people of our economy, right? It can get really big. So you have to manipulate within your confines, within the rules of the algorithm. So if you understand the algorithm, and then you understand these three: institution, market makers, retail traders, what is the difference between these three and the algorithm? Retail traders are people, market makers are people, institutions are people, algorithm is computer. People have emotions, and people can be pushed into situations. And when pushed in situations, have different reactions of psychology. So in war, if you surrounded your enemy, they could potentially surrender or try to fight to the death. If in trading, retail was given an opportunity and the market makers and the institutions got together and wanted to manipulate the same trade they were getting in, for example, you get into sells off of your retail pattern, they drop the market enough for you to feel the euphoria and try to add more to your position, and then they sweep it right back to where you originally got in, messing with your head. Those two are surrounding you, which forces you to surrender, which means you now will need to sell. That is the psychological operation of presenting you an opportunity, manipulating that opportunity, and putting you in a bad spot. So now you might not want to take the next trade that you see or participate 2-3 times as hard with a bigger position because of the experience that you had. Everyone's going to have a different type of psychological reaction. So when it comes down to this war mentality, it's going to take you to sit down with yourself first before you can study your enemy, because you need to understand, how do you operate? How do you psychologically get put into positions? And then what is your reaction when you do said thing? Because when you understand how you move, then you will stop allowing your enemy to move you. That's a quote from Sun Tzu. So if you can think in this philosophy of war strategy, we're going to come up with tons of different ways to, for one, analytically do it on the charts, but also the psychology of your own mind, right? What are the questions that you need to ask yourself in order to put you in a position of learning, to understand how do you fight, what is your most advantageous battlefield, right? And what is your style? So developing this type of psychology is going to allow you to pick the right strategies in order to tackle the markets.